Hi, everybody. This is the third video on the history of Canadian trade policy. The first video looked at pre-Confederation up to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. The second video was a focus on the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. And today's video looks at the events over the last 30 years. So I'm just going to share my screen here. You should all see my slides of 1988 to present. So the events that we're looking at will be NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, CETA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, then the renegotiation of the TPP called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then we'll conclude with the renegotiation of NAFTA or the USMCA. So looking at NAFTA, this is the situation of trade relations between Canada, the US, and Mexico just before NAFTA was completed. And you can see while there was overwhelming trade between Canada and the United States and some substantive trade between Mexico and the United States, there was very little trade between Canada and the United States. Let's look at the attitudes of the three countries going into the negotiations. We'll start with Mexico. Free trade was a radical departure in Mexico's foreign economic policy. For decades, Mexico had a long history of protectionism. But the debt crisis, where Mexico had to be bailed out in the early 1980s because of loans that it owned to private banks, started to reconsider the role of government intervention. Then in 1988, Carlos Salinas, who was an economist educated at Harvard, decided he wanted to liberalize the Mexican economy. We also had the legacy of the Canada-US agreement. Mexico saw what transpired there, saw the benefits that accrued to both Canada and the United States, and therefore he decided to do the same thing. And he wanted to pursue an agreement, a bilateral agreement with just the United States. But unlike the Canada-US agreement, this would be the first time that we saw a comprehensive free trade agreement between a developed country and a developing country, or in this case, two developed countries. Mexico initiated NAFTA. Mexico pursued NAFTA. It was clearly a Mexican idea. As for the United States, the US was frustrated with international trade as it was occurring. The Uruguay round was still going on, it was stalled, and it decided instead to negotiate regional agreements. First, the Canada-US agreement, and then subsequently NAFTA. The US was also concerned about Fortress Europe as the European community, the European Union, was starting to mobilize and create its own customs union and other matters. And the US was then concerned about trade with the Europeans. So the US hoped that a NAFTA agreement would induce both the Europeans and the Japanese to offer concessions through the Uruguay round and through GATT. The US also wanted both Canada and Mexico to ease the regulations on foreign investment and natural resources. Particularly Mexico's oil company, Pemex, was constitutionally protected, and it was a large barrier to investment. So foreign investment, there was some work that was done with the Canada-US agreement, but the US hoped that NAFTA could open it up even more. And in return, the US said that it would be willing to accept more Canadian and Mexican goods in return. Largely Mexican goods because Canada, of course, already had the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. There was also hope that if there was greater economic development in Mexico, that it would prevent or mitigate or reduce the amount of illegal migration going from Mexico and the United States. So there were other issues besides trade that the Americans wanted to deal with. As for Canada, Canada initially, we weren't interested in NAFTA. We were interested in a free trade agreement with the United States, and we got that. And as one of the earlier slides showed, we had very little trade with Mexico in the early 1990s and little interest in Mexico in the 1990s. But what Ottawa was concerned about was what would happen if the US had a free trade agreement with Canada and the US had a free trade agreement with Mexico, but there was no agreement between Mexico and the United States. It would mean that if you were a foreign investor from Europe or Japan and you wanted access to all three North American markets, you would put that investment in the United States. This is what we refer to as a hub and spoke model, where the US was the hub with different spokes, one north to Canada, one south to Mexico. Therefore, Ottawa, while it wasn't necessarily in favor of NAFTA, it didn't want to be absent from NAFTA. And so the result was to continue the move to free trade that had been initiated with the Canada-US agreement. There was also an opportunity, now that there was a third party there, that there could be improvements upon the Canada-US free trade agreement. And the result, in fact, was NAFTA was an improvement. It was more precise. The procedures were more transparent, particularly when it comes to dispute settlement, and the coverage covered more sectors of the economy. And so the Canada-US agreement has been superseded by NAFTA. Canada also received an extension clause. So if, for example, Brazil or Argentina or Chile or some of the Central American countries decided to join NAFTA, it wouldn't take a brand new set of negotiations. There was simply a clause where those countries could join an existing agreement. This would hopefully facilitate a more rapid expansion. And in the mid-90s, there was a belief that NAFTA could go well beyond North America. That has not happened. There were some preliminary discussions, but in the end, NAFTA has been restricted to 3 countries. And there's a photo with Salinas, George H.W. Bush, Brian Mulroney, and their various trade ministers signing NAFTA. So what was in the NAFTA agreement? Well, a whole series of reducing trade barriers across the 3 countries. Tariffs, non-tariff trade barriers. There was a protection of intellectual property rights and a better dispute settlement mechanism than what had existed in the Canada-US agreement. There were also side agreements that were central to both Bill Clinton's and Jean Chrétien's election campaign. So even though I showed the clip of Brian Mulroney and George H.W. Bush signing NAFTA, it did not get ratified until both of them had left office. In Bush's case, he lost to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton had campaigned in 1992 on greater environmental protection. And Jean Chrétien won the 1993 election, also promising greater labor rights and environmental protection in NAFTA. And so they didn't rip up the agreement. Instead, there were side agreements dealing with these 2 matters. They also committed to sustainable development and talking about hazardous waste and endangered species that would all take precedence over NAFTA. They also promised not to establish pollution havens by lowering standards to attract investment. And this was particularly aimed at the Mexicans where there was a concern that Mexico, to attract manufacturing, would lower its standards and encourage companies to move there. Both the United States and Canada were worried about that, and Mexico did agree that it would not reduce its environmental standards. The panels around the environment said that they would have clear and full access to scientific expertise, that this would be based on science, not based on politics. And they established the Committee on Environmental Cooperation. It was the only formal institution created as a result of NAFTA. So unlike the World Trade Organization in Geneva or the European Union in Brussels, there is no formal headquarters of NAFTA. There's no pension plan, there's no cafeteria, there's no building. With the exception of this small committee, which is based in Montreal, and you can see by its budget, it is quite small. But it was a sense that environmental cooperation was going to be important. NAFTA also incorporated the exemption that is listed in GATT that allows government to protect their environment, even with measures that conflict with the trade agreement. So what have been the benefits of NAFTA? Well, obviously, Mexico stood the most to gain. It was the least developed of the three countries. It would give them access to investment. Canada maintained its access to the US market and also was able to diversify to Mexico and hopefully to the rest of Central and South America. The United States stood to gain from access to the Mexican market, cheaper labor, cheaper parts, reliable oil, both from Canada, but as well as Mexico. Both Canada and Mexico were oil exporters. The hope that it would lead to less immigration flows, particularly illegal immigration coming from Mexico. But ultimately, really, the benefits were going to go to Mexico more than Canada or the US. What were the concerns raised about NAFTA? That US manufacturing wouldn't be able to compete with the lower paid, lower skilled Mexican workers. They were worried that this would lead to wages dropping in the United States or plants relocating to Mexico. And in fact, that is what transpired. There were low-wage, lightly skilled plants that assembled in what was called the Maquiladora region, which was just alongside the US border, so the northern part of Mexico. What were the benefits? Well, Mexico continued to exempt its oil from investment or from competition from NAFTA. So Pemex, which was constitutionally protected in Mexico, is also protected in NAFTA. As well, we continued our exemptions over culture in Canada around television, radio, books, newspapers, etc. That was able to remain the same going from Canada-US agreement to NAFTA. Agricultural subsidies weren't contained in NAFTA. And this is a big one, Chapter 11. The Chapter 11 part of NAFTA was investor state protection. So if there was a foreign investor in a country and that country took steps to hinder it, to reduce its profits, to nationalize it, to not treat it fairly, to not treat it as it would a national company, not receive national treatment, it could appeal to arbitration, that dispute settlement arbitration. And there were also concerns that, well, Mexico would not reduce its environmental protection laws, it might reduce its enforcement of those environmental protection measures. So what has been the overall NAFTA impact? There's the Trey Ombre again, Salinas, Bush, and Mulroney. Trilateral trade dramatically increased between the three countries. It made NAFTA bigger than the European Union at the time, whether that was about population, whether it was about geographic size, or whether it was about gross domestic product. Even though the Europeans would have 25 countries and NAFTA only had 3. It was true that some U.S. jobs were lost to Mexico, but there was also job creation that occurred in the United States because of growth. So some jobs were lost, different jobs replaced them. And unfortunately, the development gap between the U.S. and Canada and the U.S. And Mexico widened. It didn't weaken. And there's been democratization in Mexico. The 2000 election, which saw the PRI lose for the first time in about 80 years, and the election of Vicente Fox, was due in part to the economic aspects of NAFTA, but also some of the political aspects of NAFTA. So there was domestic political reform in Mexico as a result of NAFTA. There were changes in investment flows, but they were quite small. Closer political ties, not with the agreement, were built between the three countries. Unfortunately, it's really a dual bilateralism. So there's still a lot of linkage between Canada and the United States, and a lot of linkage between the US and Mexico. And despite the fact that trade and investment and tourism between Canada and Mexico has increased, it's really not a trilateral agreement in the sense. And as I mentioned before, with the Environmental Cooperation Committee, there is a lack of multilateral institutional support like we see in the European Union or we see in the World Trade Organization. So that concludes our discussion around NAFTA. The next big event is the World Trade Organization. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide or on this case because we look at that in other parts of the course. But the Uruguay round finally completes itself in the mid-1990s, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade becomes the World Trade Organization, and it takes force January 1st, 1995. Canada was a charter member of the WTO, and what it showed is despite the efforts over the last decade with bilateral trade or trilateral trade, Canada was still a committed member of multilateralism when it came to trade, just as we were throughout the post-World War II era under GATT. The next agreement, we're going to jump forward about 20 years, and that is linking Canada and the European Union with what was known as the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA. The negotiations began in 2014 under the Stephen Harper government, but they were finalized and completed in 2017 under the Justin Trudeau government. This is important because it shows, at least amongst the two large parties in Canada, there is now a consensus on the importance of free trade. Remember, that was not the case during the debate over the Canada-US agreement in the 1980s. But over time, the Liberals have adopted many of the things that the Conservatives have, and the Conservatives have continued to believe in free trade. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was signed in 2016. It involved 12 countries, and there's the countries that are listed there. And the purpose was to link Asia-Pacific and North America, particularly linking Japan with the United States, but also including Canada on the North American side, and Vietnam, and Singapore, and Australia and New Zealand on the Asia side. But the other part was to isolate China. China is the big country in Asia. It is one of the growing power in the world. But the Asian countries were really concerned about China. And this was a way of addressing China by balancing them with an agreement with the North American countries. The TPP would lower tariff and non-tariff trade barriers, but it would also establish an investor state dispute settlement mechanism similar to NAFTA's Chapter 11. So while the agreement had been reached, all the countries had signed it, it hadn't been ratified yet. So I've mentioned earlier that there's a difference between signing a treaty and ratifying a treaty. Signing it is done by the negotiators. You might bring in your head of government to do the final signing. But until you've implemented it into your legal system, until you have passed it in your parliament or Congress, it hasn't been ratified yet. It doesn't come into force yet. But Donald Trump becomes US president in January of 2017. He's elected in November. He's inaugurated in January of 2017. He was a strong critic of free trade. He had blasted China. He had blasted Mexico. He was upset with the WTO. He was upset with NAFTA, and he was upset with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But because it had been signed and not ratified, he was able to rescind his signature without the complications of the negotiations that would ultimately occur with NAFTA, that I'll talk about a bit later. The withdrawal of the United States put the TPP in grave jeopardy. After all, the US was the biggest member of the organization. Now it was gone. What would the other 11 countries do in the absence of the US? Well, they decided they were going to keep the agreement. And they eventually signed a new agreement in March of 2018. And it came into force once those countries ratified it in December of 2018. They did change the name, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. It incorporates most of what was in the TPP, but there was a series of provisions that the US had really wanted. The other countries were opposed to it, but they said okay because they wanted the Americans as part of the agreement. When the Americans left, then those provisions they got rid of. They also lowered the threshold for it coming into force so that participation for the United States was not required. These 11 countries, even with the absence of the United States, is not insignificant. They have over 500 million people and a combined GDP of $13.5 trillion. And for Canada, the key benefit was a free trade agreement with Japan. Going back to the 1970s and the third option, Canada had wanted some sort of trade agreement with Japan. It couldn't do that bilaterally, but as part of the CPTPP, we now have free trade between Canada and Japan. There were provisions around state-owned enterprises. There were provisions around protecting intellectual property. And for Canada in particular, the environment and labor rights that had been discussed in NAFTA were greatly strengthened in the CPTPP. And that is why they added the words comprehensive and progressive. And progressive refers to the environmental and labor standards. They also preserved the right of governments to regulate in the public interest, so governments would still trump companies. And it was able to protect both its culture, as it had fought with the US and with NAFTA, as well as its linguistic minorities. All of that was achieved in the CPTPP. Our last topic is the renegotiation of NAFTA. As I mentioned, Donald Trump had raged against NAFTA throughout the 2016 campaign. He referred to it over and over again as the worst trade deal ever. The moment that he was inaugurated, he wanted to begin renegotiating NAFTA. There was a threat that Trump might unilaterally withdraw from the agreement. He often made that threat. We don't know what would have happened because, well, an agreement has to be ratified in Congress. Does that mean that the president could unilaterally withdraw, or would that require congressional approval to withdraw? Could that create a constitutional battle between the Congress and the president? We don't know. We still don't know, but it never did transpire. In November of 2017, the United States Trade Representative listed a set of objectives of what the U.S. wanted to achieve in NAFTA. It wanted to reduce its trade deficit, particularly with Mexico. The U.S. has a trade deficit with Canada when it comes to manufacturing and primary products, but if you include services, then the U.S. has a small trade surplus. So in the Canada-U.S. case, it's tough to determine deficits versus surplus, but the U.S. did have a large trade deficit with Mexico. The Americans wanted to get rid of the dispute settlement mechanism. They believed that that hindered the ability of the U.S. government to apply countervailing duties and anti-dumping. They wanted to change the auto sector rules of origin. They wanted to increase that to 85% North American content, which used to be 62.5% North American content, to get free trade access between the three countries. They wanted reciprocity on public works, whether those are bridges, highways, things like that, on a dollar-for-dollar basis. They wanted to get rid of Canada's import quotas on dairy, poultry, and eggs. They wanted to strengthen the intellectual property rights, and they wanted a sunset clause so that the agreement would have to be renegotiated every 5 years. What did Canada want? It was, again, largely defensive. We wanted to keep NAFTA with as little drama as possible. For Canada, NAFTA was a good thing. Yes, there were things that could be improved on, but they wanted the heart of NAFTA to remain, particularly the trade dispute settlement mechanism. And you can see that this was going to be a fight between the United States, which wanted to get rid of it, and Canada, which believed it was non-negotiable and needed to be there. Canada also wanted greater access to government procurement to deal with the Buy American provisions that not just Trump, but previous administrations had included, where government projects had to favor government companies, not just at a national level, but at a state and local level as well. They wanted greater labor mobility, so workers could go back and forth between the three countries much easier. And they wanted stronger environmental protection, gender equality, and indigenous rights. So the things that they added into the CPTPP, now they wanted to strengthen those in NAFTA. Well, what did Mexico want? Well, in one sense, Mexico's objectives were similar to Canada's. Mexico had greatly benefited from NAFTA. It had developed, jobs had occurred, economic growth. So they wanted NAFTA with as few changes as possible. So what happened during the negotiations? Well, initially they started with the three countries, but by the summer of 2018, negotiations were suspended and the U.S. negotiated separately with Mexico. Canada was on the sidelines, but they would be getting regular briefs, ironically, from the Mexicans, not from the Americans, about what was going on. In late August 2018, the Americans and Mexicans announced that they had a deal. On auto content, 75% of the parts of a vehicle would have to be made in North America to get tariff-free access. It was an increase from 62%, but not as high as 85% as the Americans had initially wanted. Mexico also agreed that its auto workers would receive a minimum of $16 an hour. That still put them almost half of what American and Canadian workers would get, but it was a substantial increase of what previous Mexican workers would get. So it greatly benefited Mexican workers, but it also helped American and Canadian workers, that companies wouldn't shift work to lower wage, lower skilled Mexicans. The sunset clause went from 5 years to 16 years, but there would be a brief review after 6 years. 6 years is a very important point because it would be no single US president would be involved. They would either have to be reelected or cut across two different administrations. And including a 16-year agreement was better than a 5-year agreement in the terms of the Canadians and the Mexicans. So US and Mexico reach a deal. Now Canada comes back. And Canada has two tasks in front of it. One, it's got to agree with what Mexico and the US had agreed to. And we did. This happened pretty quickly. We were fine with the sunset clause. We were fine with the auto sector arrangements. But then there were specific items connected to Canada around dispute settlement. As I've mentioned previously, this was a major non-negotiable item for Canada, just as it was in the 1980s. They wanted to protect Canada's dairy supply management, particularly Canada's dairy farmers, and they wanted greater patent protection for pharmaceuticals. But the clock was ticking. US congressional rules meant that they wanted a decision made by August of 2018. It would allow Congress to vote on a new agreement before its midterm elections in November of 2018. Plus, it would allow the US Congress to ratify it before a new Mexican president came in. Enrique Peña had been replaced. They only served one term in Mexico, and Andrés Manuel López Obrador was the new president, very much a social democrat who they were concerned might be bringing in more protectionist measures and may not be happy with this NAFTA agreement. So there was a series of deadlines. They didn't reach the first deadline of August, so they do what countries do. They simply establish a new deadline. They got an extension, October 1st, 2018. And this time, an agreement was reached. It was signed in Buenos Aires in late November 2018. Buenos Aires was hosting the G20 summit, and so all the leaders, the NAFTA leaders, were there, so they signed it. Ratification, however, was delayed due to US congressional Democrats. Ultimately, though, it was ratified. Once the US ratified it, then Canada ratified it, Mexico had already ratified it, and NAFTA finally came into force July 1st, 2020. And there's a picture of them signing. There's Peña, there's Trump, there's Trudeau, and their trade ministers, Chrystia Freeland's behind Trudeau when they signed it in Buenos Aires. The vast majority of what was in NAFTA remained untouched, but there were some significant changes. First, the name change. I keep referring to it as either the new NAFTA or the USMCA. President Trump always calls it the USMCA, which allows him to say that he repealed and replaced NAFTA. NAFTA had a very negative connotation with Americans, particularly in the Rust Belt states that Trump narrowly won in 2016. So Trump could say, because there was a name change, that he had repealed it and replaced it. So the name change may seem silly in Canada or Mexico. It was a big deal to President Trump. The trade dispute mechanism remained intact. This was something that Trudeau and Freeland wanted, just as Mulroney and Wilson had wanted it with the Canada-US agreement and with NAFTA. So it stayed. There was an increase in the Canadian dairy market for American farmers. And while the Canadian farmers remain upset, it simply replicates the additional access that was granted under the CETA to the Europeans or the CPTPP to the Asians. This covered online retail sales. Back in the 1990s, that wasn't an issue. It's a huge issue now. And so there still is duty-free access for sales. So if you order from Amazon and it comes into Canada, you're not paying tariffs on that. The proportionality clause around energy, which had restricted the ability of Canada to constrain the export of energy products, was removed. That meant that Canada had to maintain its oil and gas exports to the United States, the percentage. It could lower that, it could lower the overall rate, but it couldn't lower the percentage. But that clause was removed. And it was removed because the US by this point had become energy self-sufficient as a result of the shale oil revolution. There was greater intellectual property protection by extending the number of years that patents and copyright protection could be maintained, particularly related to pharmaceutical drugs, before you could develop knockoffs. Canada was more relieved than celebratory that it achieved the USMCA. The whole point was to keep the agreement with as few changes as possible. And I think they achieved that. And so the most important parts of the agreement, actually having an agreement, was achieved. The assurance that Mexico would remain part of the agreement was achieved. And the maintenance of the dispute resolution mechanism was also remained. The concessions that they gave may hurt specific industries like dairy, but they ultimately benefit Canadian consumers, particularly when we talk about online purchases that cross borders. So while Canada had only a few gains, it was able to minimize its losses. But the brinksmanship of this, the tactics, for example, when the Trump administration unilaterally opposed steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada and claimed that it was for national security reasons, greatly damaged the Canada-US relationship. And we'll have to see what will be the trade relationship between Canada and the US now that Donald Trump is gone and Joe Biden is coming in. I don't expect the Biden administration to go back to the drawing board and try to renegotiate NAFTA again, but Biden will have a more normal relationship than what we saw with Donald Trump. And here's just a set of stats to show how important each of these agreements are. NAFTA remains the most important agreement to Canada, but the CPTPP is significant, so is CETA. We can also see free trade agreements with South Korea, the European Free Trade Association. Those are a group of countries in Europe that are not members of the European Union. And then down a series of Central American countries, etc., much smaller. And there are agreements that are under negotiation. I don't think we're going to continue the negotiations with Singapore or Japan because they're now part of the CPTPP, but expect negotiations with India to continue. And there's a list of Canada's largest trading partners. The United States remains both our primary export and importing partner. China is up on there as well, and then a handful of other countries, Mexico as well. Services, same list of countries. And so you can see Canada has a slight trade deficit globally when it comes to merchandise, and a slight trade deficit when it comes to services. And that concludes That concludes our third trade video. It's important to walk through all three of those. And I will be giving a separate lecture on Canadian trade actors, which is about how policy is made and who are the important stakeholders. And at this point, I will call it a close. Thank you.